What if the most sophisticated climate control system ever built wasn't made of steel, concrete, or microchips? What if it was made of sheep's wool and willow wood, assembled by hand, in a land where the nearest forest was hundreds of miles away, and it kept entire families alive through winters that could kill an unprotected person in under 10 minutes? At -40 degrees Celsius, the human body doesn't fail slowly, it fails quietly. First, your fingers stop hurting. Then your face stops hurting. And that moment, the moment the pain disappears, is the most dangerous moment of all, because your body has just stopped sending warnings. It has begun to surrender. On the Mongolian steppe, Arctic wind races across open grassland for hundreds of uninterrupted miles. No mountains, no forests, nothing to slow it down. At -40, a strong wind doesn't just feel colder. It rewrites the physics of survival entirely. Wind chill can drag what feels like -40 degrees down to what your body experiences as -70. Frostbite doesn't take hours. It takes minutes. Exposed skin begins to freeze within 5 to 7 minutes. And in the darkness before dawn, the coldest hours on the steppe, that window shrinks even further. For 1,000 years, travelers crossing this frozen sea of grass witnessed something that made no sense. A single white structure stood alone against the wind. No stone walls behind it, no woodpile beside it, no visible source of warmth. Yet inside, children slept, families cooked. Elders told stories by firelight, while the temperature outside plunged toward the edge of human survivability. This was the Gers, and it wasn't simply a tent. But here is what most people never ask, and what makes the answer extraordinary. The Mongols weren't trying to fight the cold. They had discovered something that took modern physics centuries to formally describe. Survival isn't about generating more heat. It's about losing less of it. That single insight, quiet, invisible, and thousands of years old, became the foundation of one of history's most elegant engineering systems. Every curve of the structure, every fiber of its walls, every placement of its single flame, was built around one idea: not resistance, not brute force, but precision. And yet, before any of that engineering could begin, the people of the steppe faced a problem that seemed to have no solution at all. You cannot build a warm home without materials, and across the Mongolian plateau, the land offered almost nothing. No stone quarries, no thick forests, no rivers of timber floating south from northern mountains. For thousands of square miles in every direction, there was only grass, wind, and the animals that moved through both. So how do you build one of the warmest homes on Earth, in a place where the Earth gives you almost nothing to build with? The answer didn't come from what the land provided. It came from what the animals carried on their backs. Sheep gave wool, willow branches gave poles, cattle, horses, and yaks gave leather, and something else. Something that, to outsiders, seemed almost too humble to matter: their dried dung. On the treeless steppe, firewood was not scarce. It was nearly non-existent, but argol, carefully collected and sun-dried dung from the herds, burned slowly, steadily, and with surprisingly little smoke. Not because nomads had no other choice, but because, in conditions of extreme cold and scarce fuel, argol outperformed wood in the ways that mattered most. It held heat longer. It required less tending through the night. It was available in every season, in every camp, wherever the animals grazed. Everything the Gers needed came from the animals that surrounded it. Nothing was imported. Nothing was wasted. In a landscape that appeared to offer nothing, the nomads had found everything, because they had learned to look at their world differently. But materials alone don't make a shelter. A pile of wool and willow poles is still just a pile of wool and willow poles. What transformed them into something extraordinary was a decision so simple it seems almost accidental. They chose a circle. Not because it was traditional, not because it was easy to build, but because, whether they named it or not, a circle solves problems that no other shape can solve as efficiently. Modern engineering confirms what Mongolian nomads discovered through centuries of observation. A circle encloses the maximum possible living space while exposing the minimum possible surface area to the outside world. Less surface means less heat escaping. In a shelter where every degree of warmth represents fuel burned and danger avoided, that geometric advantage is not a small detail. It is the difference between surviving the night and not. But the circle does something even more important against the wind. On the open steppe, winter gusts regularly exceed 90 kilometers per hour. A flat wall meets that force directly, absorbing it, resisting it, until something fails. Corners become fracture points. Pressure concentrates. Structures that fight the wind eventually lose to it. A Gers doesn't fight. The wind arrives, finds no flat surface to push against, no sharp corner to exploit, and flows around the structure instead. Pressure distributes evenly across the entire curved surface, leaving no single point weak enough to surrender. The lattice walls, called khana, unfold and lock into that perfect circle, while long roof poles radiate inward toward a central ring like the spokes of a wheel suspended in midair. And crucially, the entire frame is bound not with nails or rigid joints, but with leather straps. When the wind pushes, the frame doesn't crack. It shifts, absorbs, and recovers. Long before the science of aerodynamics had a name, the people of the steppe had already solved one of its central problems. Sometimes the strongest structure is not the one that refuses to move. It is the one that knows exactly how much to give. A strong frame could survive the wind, but surviving minus 40 degrees demanded something the frame alone could never provide. It demanded a wall that was alive. Mongolian felt, called eski, wasn't simply woven or sewn, it was born through pressure. Raw wool was cleaned, soaked, and rolled by hand, then compressed repeatedly until millions of individual fibers locked together into a single dense sheet. No weaving, no stitching, just fiber against fiber, bound by friction and force alone. Inside that sheet, invisible to the eye, lived countless microscopic pockets of trapped air. And air, still, trapped, motionless air, is one of the poorest conductors of heat that nature provides. When locked inside felt, it doesn't just slow the movement of warmth from inside to outside, it resists it. In winter, families added layer after layer until the walls reached 10 to 15 centimeters thick. Some researchers suggest that felt at this thickness performs comparably to a brick wall nearly 4 times its depth, though the precise comparison depends heavily on conditions and construction quality. But felt offered something brick could never offer. It breathed. Every breath exhaled, every pot of tea boiled, every body sleeping through the night released moisture into the air. In a sealed shelter at minus 40, that moisture doesn't stay as vapor. It freezes, inside the walls, inside the insulation, slowly destroying the very barrier meant to protect the family within. Many winter shelters throughout history failed not from the cold itself, but from the moisture the cold trapped inside them. Felt allowed water vapor to pass slowly outward before it could accumulate. Meanwhile, the natural lanolin still present in the wool fibers repelled moisture moving inward from snow and frost. The wall kept warmth in. It let breath out. It refused to let the cold enter in return. It didn't just protect the family. It existed in a quiet conversation with the world outside, letting enough through in each direction to keep everything in balance. Yet insulation without heat is only half a system. The Gers needed a source of warmth, and where that source was placed changed everything. Most cultures in cold climates position their fire against a wall, instinctively perhaps, seeking the sense of shelter a solid surface behind the flame seemed to offer. The Mongols placed theirs at the exact center of the circle. That single decision unlocked the full potential of every other element in the shelter. Heat from the central stove radiated outward in every direction simultaneously, reaching all parts of the living space equally. No cold corner formed near the door. No warm pocket gathered uselessly against one wall while the opposite side stayed frigid. As hot air rose naturally toward the roof, cooler air drifted back along the floor toward the flame, creating a slow, continuous cycle of convection that moved warmth through the shelter without any mechanical assistance. No fans, no ducts, no technology beyond the unchanging laws of physics. At night, the fire was not kept burning at full strength. Families allowed it to settle into deep, slow-burning embers, Argol's greatest advantage over wood. Those embers held their heat for hours. And the thick felt walls, already saturated with the warmth of the evening, released it back slowly into the sleeping space through the coldest hours before dawn. The stove was never simply a fire. It was the heart of a living system. And like any heart, Its placement was not accidental. Move it from the center, and the entire body of the shelter begins to fail. Cold pockets form. Fuel burns faster. The family wakes colder than they should. The Mongols understood something that took modern building science centuries to rediscover. In a carefully designed system, position matters as much as power. But there was a problem that no amount of insulation or perfectly placed fire could solve alone. A sealed shelter at -40 degrees is not a sanctuary. It is a slow trap. Every breath releases carbon dioxide. Every flame consumes oxygen and releases smoke. Every pot boiled, every body sleeping, every moment of ordinary life inside a closed space adds moisture and depletes the air that makes life possible. Seal a shelter completely against the cold, and you haven't saved the family inside. You've simply changed the nature of the danger. The Mongols understood this, and their solution sat at the very top of the Gers, open to the sky. The tuno, the circular wooden ring at the crown of the roof, was more than a structural element. It was the lungs of the entire shelter. Smoke from the central stove rose naturally toward the opening, carrying excess heat, moisture, and stale air upward and out. A movable felt cover, controlled by ropes from inside, allowed families to regulate this flow with precision. In calm weather, the tuno opened wider. In a blizzard, it narrowed, just enough to maintain the steady exchange of air the shelter needed, without surrendering the warmth it had taken hours to build. The south-facing door completed the system. Low and deliberately narrow, it blocked the dominant north wind while welcoming the weak winter sun during the short daylight hours. In the coldest months, even a few degrees of passive solar gain reduced the fuel a family needed to survive the night. What modern architecture calls passive ventilation, the people of the steppe had already built into every Gers constructed for 1,000 years, not as innovation, but as inheritance. The tuno didn't just remove smoke. It created the pressure differential that made the entire airflow system function. The breathable felt walls allowed slow exchange along the sides. The door managed what entered at the base, and the tuno governed what left at the top. 3 elements. One continuous, silent, self-regulating breath. The Gers didn't simply contain its inhabitants, it breathed with them. But even a perfectly engineered shelter could fail if it stood in the wrong place. Before a single pole was raised, before a single layer of felt was unrolled, the most important decision had already been made: where to stop, where to stand, where to ask the landscape itself to become the first wall. Mongolian nomads returned to the same winter camps across generations, not from habit, but from hard-earned knowledge that certain places simply survived better than others. A low hillside interrupted the north wind before it ever reached the felt walls. A shallow valley offered protection without becoming a frost pocket where cold air pooled and settled through the night. Rocky outcrops created natural windbreaks that no engineering could replicate as efficiently. They read the snow. Deep drifts revealed sheltered ground. Wind-scoured patches marked places where the cold never stopped moving. The pattern of frost on grass, the angle of ice on stones, the direction a small shrub leaned after years of prevailing wind. All of it formed a map that existed nowhere except in the memory of people who had learned to read it. A shift of 30 or 40 meters in camp placement could produce a difference of 5 to 8 degrees in overnight temperature. In conditions where fuel was finite and the margin between warmth and danger was narrow, that difference was not trivial. It was everything. The landscape was never just the setting for survival. It was the first layer of the shelter, invisible, immovable, and irreplaceable. Viewed as individual elements, none of this seems extraordinary. A round frame, layers of compressed wool, a fire placed at the center, a hole in the roof, a south-facing door, a hillside chosen over a valley. Simple, almost obvious. But remove any single element, and the system begins to unravel in ways that are neither simple nor obvious. Seal the tuno completely, and moisture accumulates inside the felt until the insulation loses its power, and the family loses its warmth. Move the stove off-center, and cold pockets form at the edges, while fuel burns faster to compensate. Choose the wrong campsite, and the wind defeats every other advantage before the night is half over. This is what modern engineers call a systems approach, where the performance of the whole is not the sum of its parts, but something greater than that sum could ever be. where each element depends on every other, where strength comes not from any single feature but from the relationships between all of them. The Mongols did not name this principle. They did not write it in textbooks or teach it in academies. They simply built it, tested it against the coldest winters on Earth, refined it across generations until almost nothing remained that could be improved. And then they stopped changing it, not because they gave up on innovation, but because they had already found something close to perfect. Today, nearly half of Mongolia's population still lives in a Gers for at least part of the year. Modern materials occasionally appear, a synthetic liner here, a metal stove fitting there, but the fundamental design remains untouched. The circle, the felt, the central flame, the tuno open to the sky, not because the people who use it resist change, because after 1,000 years of testing against the harshest conditions the Earth can produce, there is simply very little left to change. Universities in Europe and North America now study the Gers as a model of passive climate design, a structure that maintains human comfort by working with natural forces rather than consuming energy to overcome them. What once seemed primitive to outsiders has become, in the language of modern sustainability, a benchmark. But perhaps the most important thing the Gers ever taught was never about engineering at all. For 1,000 years, the people of the steppe survived not by building higher walls or burning more fuel. They survived by understanding, deeply, patiently, and across generations, exactly how the world around them worked. They learned where the wind came from. They learned how heat moved. They learned what the snow was trying to tell them. And then they built a home that listened. Civilization is not always the story of what we construct against nature. Sometimes it is the story of what we learn to hear within it. If this journey into ancient survival changed the way you see what a home can be, consider subscribing to Dark Origins. Because history is filled with ideas that were never primitive. They were simply so far ahead of their time that the modern world is only now beginning to catch up. And the greatest discoveries may not be waiting in the future. They may be waiting in the past. Patient, quiet, and perfectly designed.